It was supposed to be a quiet Saturday morning in the suburban neighborhood, the kind where the air felt crisp, the grass was freshly cut, and the sound of sprinklers clicking against the silence was the loudest interruption. For weeks, the neighborhood had seemed calm, but beneath that calm ran an undercurrent of HOA rules, property disputes, and the notorious presence of a woman many had come to call Karen. She had a reputation for patrolling the streets like a self-appointed sheriff, reporting the smallest of infractions and loudly inserting herself into situations that didn't concern her. And while most people had managed to ignore her, I hadn't yet realized that her fixation was about to land directly on me. My garage door had been broken for months. It was one of those repairs I had been putting off, sticking stubbornly halfway whenever I tried to open it. Finally, I set aside the morning to fix it. With a new part delivered earlier in the week, I rolled up my sleeves and decided today was the day. The sun was barely up when I grabbed my toolbox, pushed the button, and watched as the heavy door groaned its way upward for the first time in weeks. The moment it creaked open, the neighborhood peace shattered. From across the street I heard a sharp gasp, followed by hurried footsteps on concrete. It was Karen. She was already storming down her driveway, her phone gripped tightly in her hand, eyes wide with something that looked less like curiosity and more like outrage. I felt the weight of her stare long before she reached the curb. And then, without hesitation, she raised her phone to her ear and started speaking in the panicked tone of someone reporting an emergency. At first, I thought she was calling the HOA board, as she often did for every small complaint. But it became clear within seconds that this wasn't a neighborly tattle. She was dialing 911. Her voice carried across the street, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. She screamed into her phone that a car was being stolen. Her car. My head snapped toward the garage, confusion hitting me like a punch. Sitting in the middle of my garage was my sedan, the same one I'd been driving for 3 years, the same one parked in that spot every single day. Yet here she was, shouting hysterically that it wasn't mine at all, but hers. The absurdity of the accusation struck me, but her performance made it dangerous. She shouted details describing the make, model, and color of my car to the dispatcher, her voice rising higher with every word. She claimed she had just purchased it, that I had somehow broken into her property and stolen it in broad daylight, and now was brazenly hiding it in my garage. Neighbors started peeking from their blinds, drawn to the chaos. Within minutes, whispers spread along the street like wildfire. I could feel every eye on me. The quiet morning had transformed into a stage, with Karen as the lead actress, putting on a show for the whole neighborhood. I stood frozen, caught between disbelief and the sinking realization that things were spiraling faster than I could control. Her accusations were specific and insistent, as though she had rehearsed this scene. She shouted about a receipt, a sale, a transfer of ownership that supposedly proved she was telling the truth. The louder she got, the less anyone else seemed to question her. I wanted to explain, to call out how ridiculous the claim was, but the 911 call had already been made. Once the police were on their way, there was nothing I could say or do to stop what was coming. Karen, satisfied with her performance, crossed her arms and stood at the edge of my driveway like a guard staking her territory. Every time I moved, her eyes narrowed, her voice shot out, warning the invisible audience that I was dangerous, that I was trying to cover up evidence, that I was the thief. The irony was unbearable. I was standing in my own driveway, in front of my own house, beside my own garage, and somehow I was already being painted as the criminal. The HOA president soon appeared, having been summoned by the commotion, and though his expression betrayed doubt, he listened as Karen dramatically recounted the crime unfolding before his eyes. He shook his head, muttered something about letting the authorities handle it, and backed away to watch from a distance. No one stepped in. No one defended me. Minutes ticked by like hours. I could already hear sirens faintly in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. My stomach churned. I knew that once those flashing lights pulled up to the curb, I would no longer be just a homeowner with a nosy neighbor. I would be the suspect in a theft I hadn't committed. And Karen, standing smugly at the ready, looked eager to play her part as the star witness. As the sirens closed in, my neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Garage door half open, toolbox abandoned at my feet, I realized this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Because if Karen was bold enough to call 911 over a lie this absurd, then what else was she willing to do to get her way? And just as the flashing lights turned the corner and the first police car slowed in front of my house, I understood that my life in this neighborhood was about to change forever. The flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet suburban street in sharp, jarring colors, shattering the calm that once defined Saturday mornings in the neighborhood. 2 police cruisers pulled up to my driveway, their tires crunching against the asphalt. And within seconds, uniformed officers stepped out, scanning the scene with practiced caution. Karen's hand shot up like a signal flare, her voice slicing through the tension as she rushed forward to meet them. She pointed straight at me, her tone frantic and commanding, as though she were the victim who had been waiting for rescue. The officers listened, their expressions neutral but attentive, while she unloaded her story with exaggerated detail. She spoke of a recent purchase, a receipt she supposedly had, a car that was hers but had mysteriously vanished, only for her to catch me red-handed, attempting to conceal it in my garage. Every gesture, every word she spoke dripped with drama, her voice breaking into staged desperation. The neighbors who had quietly gathered at a distance hung on her every word as though they were watching a live performance. It didn't matter that the claim was ludicrous. Her conviction made it seem possible. I stood frozen at the mouth of the garage, feeling the weight of every eye and every flashing light pressing down on me. When the officers finally turned their attention in my direction, I could see suspicion flicker in their eyes. To them, this wasn't just a domestic spat or a noisy complaint. This was a report of grand theft auto, a felony. And standing in my driveway with Karen screaming in the background, I looked every bit like the suspect she painted me to be. The questions came fast and sharp. Who was I? Was this my home? Was that my car? Did I have proof of ownership? My answers tumbled out, steady but tight, as I explained that the car had been mine for years, that the garage they were looking at belonged to me, that I had documentation to prove it all. But as I spoke, Karen interrupted, her shrill voice cutting over mine, insisting that I was lying, that any documents I produced were forged, that criminals like me always had fake paperwork ready. Her confidence made my words feel smaller, weaker, even though I knew the truth was on my side. The officers asked to see my driver's license and vehicle registration, and I hurried inside to grab the folder where I kept them. But the moment I disappeared from sight, Karen raised her voice again, screaming that I was hiding evidence, that I was trying to flee, that I was about to destroy proof of the theft. By the time I stepped back outside, paperwork in hand, the officers' hands hovered closer to their holsters than before. I handed them my documents, heart pounding as they inspected them carefully. One officer examined the registration, cross-checking the VIN number on the form against the one stamped on the dashboard of the car in my garage. The silence while they verified the details was suffocating. Karen stood a few feet away, clutching her phone and shaking her head dramatically, whispering to the crowd of onlookers that she had all the proof, but had left it inside her house. She promised to retrieve it once the officers secured the stolen vehicle. When the first officer finally nodded and muttered that the documents matched, relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Karen immediately screamed that I must have faked them. She insisted that car thieves were clever, that they printed fraudulent papers online, that no matter what my documents said, the truth was that car belonged to her. Her voice cracked with feigned emotion, her eyes glistening as she painted herself, the victim of an elaborate scheme. The officers, caught between her theatrics and my calm insistence, decided to take things further. They announced they would need to run the plates through the system to confirm ownership beyond any doubt. Karen clapped her hands together as if she had just won a victory, declaring loudly to the neighbors that justice was finally being served. I stood silently, fists clenched, realizing that even if the truth came out, the damage had already been done. While one officer radioed in the license plate number, the other kept a close eye on me, his body tense as though expecting me to bolt at any second. Karen hovered close to the car, pacing dramatically, throwing glances at the crowd that had now gathered in clusters on their lawns. They whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of curiosity, disbelief, and subtle judgment. Even if the records cleared me, I knew the image had already been seared into their minds. Me, standing in front of flashing police lights, accused of theft by the loudest voice in the neighborhood. The minutes dragged on like hours until the officer's radio finally crackled with the confirmation. The car was indeed registered in my name, tied to my address, with a clean history. The verdict was clear. Karen's claim held no weight. I waited for the moment she would finally back down, apologize, maybe even show a shred of embarrassment. But instead, she doubled down. She insisted the system must be outdated, that the transfer hadn't been processed yet, that I must have bribed someone at the DMV to cover my tracks. The officers exchanged a glance, their patience thinning, but still they didn't dismiss her outright. They told her if she truly believed the car belonged to her, she would need to produce legal documentation, proof of sale, title transfer, or any legitimate paperwork to support her claim. Karen nodded furiously, promising she had exactly that, and more waiting at her house. She declared she would return with the evidence, her voice booming as she marched back across the street, practically glowing with the belief that she had the upper hand. The officers, now calmer, warned me to remain available while they sorted things out. I nodded, but inside I felt the weight of what had just unfolded. It wasn't enough that the truth was clear in the records. Karen wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. She had turned the entire neighborhood into her audience, and she wasn't about to let her show end here. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the police remained stationed near my driveway, I stood staring. At my garage, my car still sitting there, and wondered just how far Karen was willing to take this delusion. And deep down, I already knew. This was only the beginning. The neighborhood felt unsettled after the police left me standing on my own driveway. The flashing lights had faded, but the memory of them lingered in the eyes of the neighbors who had witnessed everything. I could sense the whispers behind, curtains and the judgment simmering under polite faces. Karen had promised to return with proof, and if there was one thing everyone knew about her, it was that she thrived on spectacle. She had turned what should have been a simple morning into a public trial, and now she was preparing for round 2. It didn't take long. Within half an hour, Karen reappeared from her house across the street, marching toward my driveway with a stack of papers clutched dramatically in her hands. Theatrical as ever, she waved them above her head like a winning lottery ticket. Her voice carried down the street, announcing that she had all the documentation needed to prove I had stolen her property. She shouted words like title, sale, agreement, and ownership, as though she were presenting the ultimate checkmate. The officers, still waiting by their cruisers, turned their attention toward her. She handed them the papers with a flourish, her eyes never leaving mine, her smirk dripping with self-satisfaction. She clearly believed this would be the moment I was exposed, humiliated, and dragged away in handcuffs. The neighborhood, once, again leaned out from porches and windows, eager for the next act of the drama. But as the officers examined the papers, the cracks in her story began to show. The documents were a haphazard collection of printouts and handwritten notes, none of them official, none of them consistent. One appeared to be a bill of sale, scrawled in ink, with no signatures beyond a shaky scribble that looked suspiciously like her own. Another was a generic car advertisement clipped from a website, the same make and model as mine, but with a completely different VIN number. The rest were little more than receipts for random vehicle-related purchases that had nothing to do with ownership. The officers exchanged looks, their patience visibly thinning as they sifted through the pile. Karen, undeterred, filled the silence with her own commentary, pointing to each page and explaining, loudly, how it proved her case. She insisted that mistakes in paperwork were common, that clerical errors at the DMV explained why the system still had the car under my name, that she was simply the victim of bureaucratic incompetence. The more holes the officers found in her evidence, the louder she became, as though volume could compensate for the absence of truth. When the officers finally told her the documents weren't valid, she refused to accept it. She crossed her arms, raised her chin, and declared that she would take the matter higher. She threatened lawsuits, HOA board meetings, even the involvement of federal authorities if necessary. Her voice quivered with self-righteous indignation, painting herself as a crusader for justice rather than a neighbor spiraling into delusion. But the officers, now weary, laid down the boundary she didn't want to hear. They told her plainly that unless she could produce legitimate legal documentation, an official title transfer, notarized sale, or something verifiable, there was no case. They warned her against making false reports, hinting that another 911 call like this without evidence could have consequences for her. It was the closest anyone had come to calling out her behavior. But Karen stood defiant, her fists clenched, her face flushed with rage. The crowd, sensing the tension had reached another peak, buzzed with whispers. Some looked embarrassed for her, others skeptical, but many remained quiet, unwilling to challenge her directly. Karen thrived in that silence. To her, it wasn't defeat. It was a temporary setback. She snapped up the papers, stuffed them under her arm, and hissed that she would be back with real proof, evidence so undeniable that no one could question her again. Then she turned on her heel and stormed back to her house, her departure just as loud as her arrival. The officers, satisfied that the situation was under control, gave me a few final words of reassurance. They reminded me to keep my documents handy, to report any further harassment, and to let them know if she attempted to escalate things. With that, they climbed into their cruisers and drove off, leaving behind a street that had become more of a stage than a neighborhood. But the unease didn't fade with their departure. I could feel it lingering in the stares of my neighbors, in the hushed conversations that stopped when I looked their way. Some were already questioning who to believe. Karen had a way of planting seeds of doubt, and even the flimsiest accusations could take root when repeated often enough. I realized then that the police weren't the end of the problem. The real battle would be the long game Karen was already setting in motion, through the HOA, through gossip, through relentless accusations, until enough people began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. That night, as I closed my garage and locked the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching from, across the street, plotting her next move. Karen wasn't the type to back down. She was the type to dig in, to escalate, to twist every rule and every loophole until she got the outcome she wanted. And if she had to drag the entire neighborhood into the chaos with her, she would. The car sat quietly in the garage, exactly where it belonged, yet somehow it had become the center of a war I hadn't chosen. I went to bed with a heavy certainty. Karen wasn't finished. If anything, she was just getting started. The days following Karen's spectacle with the police were uneasy ones. The street seemed quieter, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of quiet that follows an explosion, the silence of neighbors whispering behind closed doors and trading theories in hushed tones. Every time I stepped outside to collect the mail or take out the trash, I felt the weight of lingering stares. It wasn't open hostility yet, but it was suspicion, planted and watered by Karen's relentless narrative. Karen, unsurprisingly, hadn't let the matter die. She turned the car accusation into her new obsession, and her battleground became the HOA. Within days, notices went out for a special meeting, called at her request, with the vague agenda of addressing serious community concerns. To anyone unfamiliar with her antics, it sounded urgent. To me, it was clear she was setting the stage for yet another performance. The evening of the meeting, the community center filled with the familiar shuffle of chairs and the murmur of neighbors. The board sat at the front, papers neatly stacked. While residents gathered in clusters, their faces curious, skeptical, or simply eager for the drama, Karen sat near the front, perched on the edge of her seat, her stack of evidence once again clutched in her hands like sacred scripture. When the meeting opened, she wasted no time. She launched into her accusations, painting a vivid picture of herself as the victim of theft, injustice, and neighborhood betrayal. She waved her papers again, pointing toward my house as though it were a crime scene, claiming that the car in my garage was rightfully hers. She spoke of a supposed sale agreement, of promises made and broken, of being cheated out of what was lawfully hers. Her words dripped with conviction, her voice rising and falling in practiced rhythm, drawing gasps and murmurs from parts of the crowd. The board members tried to interject, asking for clarity, for real documentation, but Karen brushed them aside with indignant scoffs. She accused the police of incompetence, the DMV of corruption, and me of orchestrating a fraud so elaborate it fooled every authority. To her, the only reasonable explanation was that she was right and the entire system was wrong. As she spoke, I sat in the back, silent, my documents tucked neatly in a folder. When my turn came, I stood and calmly presented the facts. I showed the title in my name, the registration, the insurance, every legitimate piece of paperwork tied directly to me and my car. My explanation was clear, logical, irrefutable. Yet as I spoke, I could see the doubt on some faces. Logic rarely won against drama, and Karen's performance had planted seeds that no stack of documents could immediately erase. The board deliberated aloud, their voices measured, but their caution was obvious. They reminded everyone that disputes involving vehicles were outside the HOA's jurisdiction, that this was a legal matter already addressed by law enforcement. They stated firmly that the HOA would not involve itself further unless legitimate evidence surfaced. It was as close to a dismissal as they could give without outright calling Karen a liar, but Karen seized even that moment. She twisted the words into validation, claiming the board's reluctance to act proved there was a cover-up. She accused them of being complicit, of protecting a criminal in their midst, of failing their duty to uphold community standards. Her theatrics turned what should have been the end of the matter into another spectacle, and by the time the meeting adjourned, the room buzzed with tension. Walking back to my car after the meeting, I felt the divide more sharply than ever. Some neighbors nodded at me reassuringly, offering quiet support. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to choose a side. A few looked at me with thinly veiled suspicion, already leaning into Karen's narrative. That was her true weapon. Not proof, not truth, but doubt. Once doubt seeped in, it spread like wildfire. Over the following days, Karen's campaign escalated. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, typed rants about theft, dishonesty, and neighbors who couldn't be trusted. She patrolled the street more aggressively, stopping passers-by to retell her story with added embellishments, each retelling making me look guiltier in her eyes. She spoke of connections at the DMV who would soon confirm her ownership, of lawyers ready to file lawsuits, of private investigators uncovering my criminal past. None of it was true, but truth had never been her concern. The HOA president stopped by one afternoon, his expression weary. He reassured me the board didn't believe her, that the matter was legally closed, but he admitted his hands were tied. Karen wasn't breaking any HOA rules by spreading rumors, and until she crossed a tangible line, the board couldn't silence her. He advised me to stay calm, to keep my documentation ready, and to let her rant burn itself out. But I knew Karen too well by now. She wasn't burning out. She was building momentum. Every whisper, every flyer, every rumor she seeded was fuel for the next explosion. And sooner or later, she would find a new way to escalate, one that would test how far the HOA, the neighborhood, and even the law could be pushed. As the sun set that evening, I watched from my porch as Karen stood at the end of her driveway, staring at my garage with a look that was equal parts fury and determination. It wasn't over, not even close, and deep down I knew the next move she made would push things into dangerous new territory. Karen's obsession with my car didn't fade after the HOA meeting. If anything, it grew sharper, like a knife being honed on a stone. The rejection from the board only fueled her sense of righteousness, convincing her that everyone around her was either blind, corrupt, or complicit. And when someone like Karen believed the system had failed, the next step was obvious. She would create her own proof, her own justice, her own story to make her lies look real. It started with small signs. One morning, I found a note taped to my garage door, written in bold block letters, "Return the car before it's too late." Another day, I noticed muddy footprints near the edge of my driveway that didn't belong to me. At first, I dismissed them as coincidence, but soon the patterns became undeniable. Things were being moved around when I wasn't looking. My trash bins were shifted out of place. A garden tool I had left near the shed was suddenly lying in the middle of the yard. It was subtle but deliberate. Karen was circling, testing the boundaries, waiting for her moment. That moment came one Friday evening. I had just returned home from work when I noticed the garage door wasn't closed. All the way. I knew I had shut it that morning, double-checking after the chaos she had already caused. But now, the heavy door hung open just enough to reveal the front end of my car. My stomach tightened. I walked closer, and that's when I saw it. A fresh scratch along the driver's side, long and jagged, the kind made by a deliberate hand, dragging something sharp against the paint. Before I could even process what had happened, Karen emerged from across the street, phone in hand, her voice already raised in a familiar pitch. She screamed that she had caught me red-handed, that I was tampering with her car, that this was proof of the theft she had been shouting about for weeks. Her voice echoed down the block, drawing neighbors from their porches like moths to a flame. Realized too late what had happened. She had staged it. She had waited for the right moment. For me to come home. For the garage door to appear suspiciously open. For damage to the car she could claim as evidence. To her, this was the final nail in my coffin. And with the crowd watching, she called 911 again, her words trembling with practiced outrage as she reported that the thief had damaged the vehicle while trying to cover up the crime. The police arrived faster this time. perhaps already familiar with the address and the caller. Their faces carried the weariness of officers dealing with a neighborhood drama spiraling out of control. Still, they examined the car, taking note of the scratch, the half-open garage, the commotion Karen stirred up around us. Once again, I presented my documents, my proof, my calm explanations. And once again, Karen shouted over me, waving her hands, declaring that she was the rightful owner and I was nothing more than a con artist who had finally slipped up. The officers looked unconvinced, but Karen had something new this time. Witnesses. She had spent weeks telling the same story to anyone who would listen. And now, a handful of neighbors stepped forward hesitantly, admitting they had heard her say the car was hers, that she had paperwork, that maybe there was some truth to her claims. Their words weren't evidence, but they added weight to her performance, enough that the officers decided to escalate the situation further. They announced they would file an official report to document the ongoing dispute, forwarding it to their department's Property Crimes Division. Karen smiled triumphantly at the words, official report, twisting them into validation of her claims. To the watching neighbors, it sounded like progress on her side. To me, it sounded like another step down a path where truth mattered less than persistence. That night, I sat in my living room, staring at the scratched car through the window, the weight of dread heavy on my chest. Karen wasn't just spreading rumors anymore. She was manufacturing them, turning lies into staged scenes, creating her own version of reality and daring me to fight against it. She knew the damage didn't need to make sense. It just needed to plant doubt. And in a neighborhood where people valued appearances and gossip, doubt was poison. By morning, the rumors had evolved again. Now it wasn't just that I had stolen her car. It was that I was covering up evidence, tampering with the vehicle, damaging it to hide tracking devices she claimed she had installed. The story grew with every retelling, gaining momentum, until even those who had once defended me started looking at me with uneasy eyes. Karen, meanwhile, strutted through the neighborhood with the air of someone who believed victory was inevitable. The HOA president stopped by once more, his tone less sympathetic this time. He explained that multiple neighbors had filed concerns about the car situation, that the board was under pressure to act, even though it wasn't technically within their jurisdiction. He warned me to prepare for a formal review at the HOA next meeting, where the board would hear both sides to calm the community unrest. I knew what that meant. Karen had dragged the fight into yet another arena, and this time, she had momentum on her side. As I stood in my driveway later that day, staring at the scar across my car's paint, I realized Karen's obsession had crossed a line. She wasn't content with rumors anymore. She wanted evidence, even if she had to create it herself, and I had the sinking feeling she wasn't done creating. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to choke on. The car theft saga had gone from a bizarre personal dispute to a community-wide spectacle, and everyone seemed desperate for resolution. Karen had spent the past week parading through the neighborhood like a politician on the campaign trail, retelling her story with new flourishes, rallying anyone who would listen. She promised that the meeting would expose the truth once and for all. The community center was packed that evening, more crowded than I had ever seen it. Neighbors filled every chair, stood against the walls, and leaned through the doorway. The HOA board looked weary, already bracing for chaos. Karen sat near the front, her stack of evidence larger than ever, her eyes gleaming with confidence. She whispered animatedly to a few sympathetic neighbors, flashing them the occasional page from her pile as if revealing state secrets. When the meeting opened, she wasted no time. She launched into her speech with a fervor that bordered on manic, accusing me of theft, fraud, harassment, and every crime she could imagine. She waved photos of the scratched car, flyers she had typed up herself, and even a crude diagram she claimed showed how I had broken into her vehicle. Her voice rose with every accusation, echoing around the room until it felt like the walls themselves were shaking. When my turn came, I stood calmly, clutching the folder of legitimate documents that had become my shield. I laid out the registration, the insurance, the title, all undeniably in my name, all verifiable through official records. My words were measured, deliberate, without the drama that had carried hers. For a moment, the board listened quietly, torn between her theatrics and my evidence. And then, something happened that Karen hadn't expected. One of the board members, tired of the endless back and forth, suggested verifying the car's ownership through an immediate VIN check. He explained that the process was straightforward and indisputable. The vehicle identification number tied the car directly to its rightful owner in state records. If Karen truly believed the car was hers, then this would settle the matter in seconds. Karen froze. For the first time, her confidence faltered. She stammered, tried to deflect, claimed the system was rigged and delayed. But the board insisted, and within minutes, they were walking with me to the parking lot, the crowd following like spectators to a final showdown. Under the harsh glow of the parking lot lights, the officer from the last incident had already arrived, prepared to assist in settling the matter once and for all. He read the VIN directly from the dashboard, called it in, and within moments, the response came back clear. The car was registered to me, tied to my name, my address, my history. There was no ambiguity, no room for spin. It was mine. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd, once buzzing with whispers and doubt, stood frozen. All eyes turned to Karen, her face flushed deep red, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She tried one last desperate move, insisting the system was wrong, that there had been a conspiracy, that I had bribed officials to cover my tracks. But her words fell flat. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't buying it. The HOA president, his patience finally gone, turned on her sharply. He reminded her of the false 911 calls, the baseless accusations, the harassment, and the division she had sown in the community. He declared that her behavior was not only unacceptable, but a violation of HOA standards, subject to fines and further legal consequences if it continued. The authority in his voice left no room for argument. Karen had been cornered, stripped of her stage. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others muttering about wasted time and unnecessary drama. A few even approached me quietly, offering apologies for doubting me, their faces tinged with embarrassment. Karen, however, stormed off into the night, clutching her stack of papers, her fury visible in every stiff movement. She didn't have the final word this time, and that was a wound she wouldn't soon recover from. In the days that followed, the street grew quieter again. The whispers faded, the flyers stopped, and Karen's presence shrank into the background. She still glared from across the street, still muttered under her breath, but the neighborhood no longer listened. The spell had broken. Her lies had finally collapsed under the weight of undeniable truth. As for me, life returned to something resembling normal. The car sat in my garage, scratched but safe, a reminder of how far Karen had been willing to go to chase a fantasy. The HOA issued her formal warnings, and the police, tired of her false reports, made it clear that another 911 stunt would have real consequences. For the first time since that Saturday morning when I had opened my garage, I felt a sense of peace, settling back over my home, but it was a fragile peace, one that carried the memory of how quickly things had spiraled out of control. I knew Karen wasn't someone who truly gave up. She was someone who simmered, who waited, who looked for her next stage. For now, though, the curtain had closed on her performance, and I had weathered the storm she tried to drown me in. And as I locked the garage that evening, I couldn't help but think how absurd it all had been. That opening a garage door on a quiet morning had led to weeks of chaos, accusations, and drama. Absurd, yes, but in a neighborhood ruled by an HOA and fueled by Karen's obsession, absurd was just another word for reality.